You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art ed?
We'll try to spice it.
Who art ed? Mr. Wood art ed me.
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I've got a TLDR mini episode about Jasper Johns. Jasper Johns was born May 15th, 1930 in Augusta, Georgia, and spent the majority of his childhood moving between various towns in South Carolina. He was raised by his grandparents and extended family members. And while he demonstrated an early interest in drawing, he didn't really have a lot of formal exposure to the fine arts in those early years. Johns did pursue an art degree at the University of South Carolina from 1947 to 1948, and then relocated to New York City, where he studied at Parsons School of Design. Then he was drafted into the U.S. Army during the Korean War, and he had a 2-year deployment in Japan. After his discharge, he returned to New York in 1953. Johns established a studio in Lower Manhattan and became a part of a close-knit circle of avant-garde artists, including Robert Rauschenberg and the composer John Cage. This community was looking to reshape the arts. It was a bit of a backlash against Abstract Expressionism, which was the dominant movement of the day, emphasizing raw emotion and spontaneous, non-representational work. Johns started off with a little bit of an abstract expressionist bent to his work, but he then decided to go his own way and created a style later classified as neo-dada, which helped to lay the groundwork for pop art. His work reintroduced recognizable, everyday imagery into fine art and changed the trajectory of mid-century American painting. He often focused on commonplace subjects like flags, targets, maps, letters, and numbers, which he depicted just very literally. Rather than focusing on emotional expression, Johns focused on the physicality of painting, often with heavily textured surfaces. His work challenged viewers to look at the familiar as physical objects rather than just signs and symbols. Now, here are 5 quick things to know about Jasper Johns. His famous flag artwork was inspired by a dream. In 1954, while living in New York City and struggling to find a unique direction for his art, Johns had a vivid dream where he saw himself painting a large American flag. Before this, he had been experimenting, trying to find his own voice, and his work was largely influenced by the abstract styles that had been dominant in the early to mid-20th century. The dream provided an immediate conceptual breakthrough. He stopped trying to invent an original abstract composition and instead moved towards pre-existing literal imagery. The morning after that dream, he went out and bought materials needed to begin constructing flag. This shifted his entire career as it introduced the whole idea of using common objects as the primary subject of a painting. By focusing on an image that was already universally recognized, Johns shifted the focus away from what was being painted to how it was being painted. Number 2. In 1954, as he was reinventing his creative identity, Jasper Johns destroyed pretty much all his previous artwork. As he was beginning his flag and target series, Johns decided that his early artistic works were just too derivative of abstract expressionists. In order to get a fresh start and a new identity, he decided to systematically destroy almost every artwork still in his possession that he had created during his early years in New York. The only works that survived this purging were minor pieces that had already been gifted to or purchased by friends. He wanted to get away from the aesthetic expectations of the art world at the time and give himself a fresh, clean start. It was a turning point that allowed him to approach the canvas and sculpture without the sort of stylistic momentum or the burden of needing to make sure his new work fit in with the old. Number 3, Jasper Johns frequently used an ancient technique called encaustic, where he painted with hot wax. Johns was dissatisfied with the slow drying time of standard oil paints. See, the oil can stay wet for so long that different layers of color will blend together on the canvas. So Johns decided to go with a really old method, encaustic painting. Encaustic is basically mixing pigments into heated beeswax and applying it directly to the surface. Because the molten wax cools and solidifies almost instantly, it allowed Johns to layer materials rapidly without blending the different brush strokes. This technique gave his paintings a really heavy impasto, a sort of tactile quality. I mean, you start to see the canvas almost as a three-dimensional object rather than a flat picture. And another benefit is, like, with the somewhat translucent layers of the hardened wax, you can even like embed things in there. For example, Johns would often embed scraps of newspaper into the wax. Number 4. Early in his career, Jasper Johns was doing commercial window displays for high-end retailers. In the 1950s, before selling his art was generating a reliable income, Johns partnered with Robert Rauschenberg to work as freelance commercial display designers. They operated under the joint pseudonym Matson Jones, and they created artistic window displays for many prominent New York luxury stores, including Tiffany & Company. They decided to use a pseudonym because back then there was kind of this stigma with doing commercial work. A lot of people had this separation in their mind between, quote, fine art and commercial art. And Johns and Rauschenberg wanted to protect their reputation in the gallery scene. But make no mistake, it is difficult work making a good eye-catching display. It required an understanding of, design principles, how to arrange things and present them. And that probably informed a lot of his approach to his, quote, fine art. Handling all that merchandise and transforming it into striking public installations no doubt reinforced his fascination with how ordinary items communicate meaning. And finally, number 5, in 2011, Jasper Johns received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. President Barack Obama awarded Johns the nation's highest civilian honor during a White House ceremony on February 15, 2011. The award recognized his significant contributions to the history of American art, noting how his work challenged traditional boundaries and inspired multiple subsequent movements, including minimalism, conceptualism, and, of course, pop art. The last painter to receive the Medal of Freedom prior to Johns was Andrew Wyeth, who was honored by President Ronald Reagan in 1988. Now, to better understand Jasper Johns, his work, and his legacy, I want to take a moment to look a little more closely at Flag, which kind of got it all started. He painted it in his studio on Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan between 1954 and 55, when Johns was just 24 years old. It's a little over 42 by 60 inches, and it consists of encaustic, oil paint, and collage elements applied to fabric, which Johns then mounted across 3 canvas panels attached to a plywood backing. It needed that rigid wooden support to hold up the weight of all the materials applied. Now, when we look at it, it's basically just what it sounds like, the American flag. He doesn't give us any other context to it. There's no compositional depth, no background, no border. It is just the flag. Specifically, the painting shows the American flag as it existed between 1912 and 1959, with 48 white stars on a field of blue, along with the traditional 13 red and white stripes representing the 13 original colonies. Rather than rendering it in the flat graphic design style of a normal flag, Johns decided to create a really highly textured surface. When you look closely, you can see all the brushstrokes in the hardened beeswax, which catch the light at different angles. Also, embedded in there, you can see pieces of torn newspaper from like the New York Times, which is kind of interesting because the flag is meant to be this timeless symbol of, the nation, and yet this painting is tied to a very specific time because it quite literally captured the zeitgeist or the spirit of the times. We have stories of the day stuck into the material that is making up the flag. Making the piece was a physically demanding process. I mean, he had to work with molten wax, mixing in the pigments and, brushing it on before the wax cools. He had to construct the stars and stripes, laying down strips of newspaper and bed sheets directly onto the wooden panels, and then using that wax as not only like a medium carrying the pigment and the paint, but also as an adhesive. And when it was all put out there, people really didn't know what to make of it. I mean, obviously it's a flag. People can recognize the flag, but when you're looking at it in this context, it kind of raises the question of, am I looking at a painting of a flag, or has the painting simply become a flag itself? Is this a representation of a flag, or is it an actual flag? This is one of those things where it's like deceptively simple. And that's what Johns is trying to do. He's trying to explore ideas of, quote, things the mind already knows, end quote. His idea was that by focusing on these highly recognizable symbols and giving everyone an entry point so they like immediately understand what is in front of them, allows them to focus on the physical execution, the texture of the medium, and the process of painting itself. Although people do become frustrated as, you see something that is so familiar, and in the art context, people are looking for maybe a political commentary or, a patriotic theme associated with the flag. Everyone has these different ideas they bring to it, but Johns is presenting it in a much more neutral way. And a lot of audiences wanted more of a message from the artist instead of just their own ideas and connections being put onto the work. Ultimately, though, this piece was highly successful. It not only changed the trajectory of Johns' career, but arguably laid the foundation for pop art, demonstrating that everyday signs and symbols were valid, serious subjects for investigation through art. This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.